In the heart of a meticulously planned suburban neighborhood, conformity was everything. Each home looked almost identical to the next, each lawn trimmed to a flawless length, each hedge squared into a perfect cube, and each driveway polished like a showroom. The neighborhood homeowners prided themselves on order and control, measuring beauty not by creativity but by precision. And then there was my garden. Unlike the sterile perfection around it, my yard was a living, breathing tapestry of color and unpredictability. Wildflowers tumbled across the edges, vines curled up wooden trellises, roses leaned into lavender bushes, and tall grasses swayed gently with every breeze. Instead of rigid lines, there was a natural flow, a softness, an invitation for bees, butterflies, and birds to stop by and make the space their own. I hadn't created it overnight. It had taken years of nurturing, planting, replanting, and experimenting with different arrangements. To me, it was a sanctuary, a canvas painted with petals and greenery. But not everyone saw it that way. Karen did not. She lived directly across from me in a house that was the epitome of strict control. Her lawn was always clipped to an inch of its life, her bushes trimmed so precisely it looked like she measured them with a ruler, and her flowers, though technically vibrant, were arranged in an unnatural row like obedient soldiers. Her yard was sterile, almost lifeless despite its beauty, and she wouldn't have it any other way. She was the kind of neighbor who noticed everything, from a car parked an inch over the curb to a trash bin set out a few hours early. And once her sharp gaze fell on my garden, it became her personal crusade. The first signs of her disapproval came in the form of long stares. I would catch her across the street, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line, glaring at the wildness of my yard. Soon after, whispered complaints to other neighbors began to circulate. According to Karen, my yard wasn't just different. It was messy, unkempt, an eyesore to the otherwise perfect community. Some neighbors ignored her, while others quietly nodded in agreement, afraid to cross her. Then came the official complaint. One afternoon, I found a letter in my mailbox, stamped with the unmistakable logo of the Homeowners Association. The message was curt and formal, accusing me of failing to maintain proper yard standards. It described my garden as disorderly and non-compliant with community aesthetic values. At the bottom was the signature of the HOA president, but everyone knew whose hand had guided it. Karen had struck. It was both infuriating and absurd. My yard wasn't messy, it was alive. But in a community where rigid order was worshipped, Karen had found an opening to twist the rules in her favor. Instead of panicking, I doubled down on my vision. If she wanted to call it messy, I would make it even more unapologetically vibrant. I expanded the wildflower patches, introduced taller grasses, and added winding stone paths that cut through bursts of color. Every corner bloomed with something new, sunflowers stretching toward the sky, clusters of daisies leaning lazily, and bright marigolds spilling into the walkway. It became a sanctuary not just for me, but for anyone passing by. Birds nested in the shrubs, bees darted from flower to flower, and butterflies painted the air with flickers of color. But Karen didn't see beauty. She saw defiance. Her campaign escalated quickly. She began cornering other neighbors during her morning walks, pointing at my yard as if it were a stain on the community. She emailed the HOA repeatedly, demanding fines, and even took photos of my garden as evidence. Each week brought a new letter, threatening penalties if I didn't conform. It became clear she wasn't just irritated, she was determined to break me. But what she didn't realize was that her hostility only fueled my resolve. I refused to let someone else dictate the soul of my garden. Every letter I received, every glare she shot my way, only convinced me further that my space was worth fighting for. Yet, as the tension grew, so did the attention. Neighbors who once ignored my yard began to notice it more. Joggers slowed down to admire the blooms. Children paused at the edge of the fence to watch butterflies dance. Even the mailman commented on the refreshing difference it brought compared to the endless rows of monotony. The whispers that Karen had once spread about ugliness began to turn against her. Some quietly admitted they liked the change, that my garden added character, that it gave the neighborhood something it desperately lacked: individuality. Karen, however, saw none of it. In her mind, she was fighting the good fight, preserving order, defending standards, saving the neighborhood from what she called chaos disguised as beauty. She didn't know it yet, but her battle against my so-called mess was about to backfire in the most spectacular way possible, because while she was busy campaigning against me, someone else had taken notice of my garden. Someone far beyond the reach of HOA rules and Karen's endless complaints, and their recognition would change everything. The letter campaign from the HOA continued in waves, but by now I had learned to treat them as background noise. Each warning, each empty threat, and each thinly veiled attempt to intimidate me had the opposite effect. It strengthened my resolve to let my garden flourish in its own way. For every complaint Karen lodged, I added something new to the yard. What began as a small personal retreat had blossomed into something much larger. Bright arches of climbing roses framed the front gate. Pathways lined with wild thyme and chamomile released soft fragrances whenever footsteps passed. Tall sunflowers acted as guardians at the edges, their golden faces towering above the rest, while bursts of tulips and daffodils gave splashes of color along the ground. What Karen called chaotic, others now began to call enchanting. Though her words were sharp, the ripple effect was undeniable. People noticed. One day, a jogger stopped to snap a photo. The next, a couple walking their dog lingered, marveling at the way butterflies hovered over the lavender. Soon after, cars slowed as they drove by, passengers peering out at the unexpected riot of color nestled between sterile lawns. And then, unexpectedly, came the moment that shifted everything. One afternoon, a young woman carrying a camera walked slowly along the sidewalk, carefully observing the blooms. She wasn't from the neighborhood, I could tell instantly. Her outfit, her professional camera, and her curious but respectful demeanor made her stand out. She circled the garden several times, taking photos from different angles, crouching low to capture the bees at work, zooming in on vines curling across wooden frames. Without a word, she scribbled something into a notebook and disappeared. Thought little of it until 2 weeks later. An envelope arrived in my mailbox, this one very different from the ones Karen had orchestrated. Inside was a neatly folded letter on crisp, heavy paper with a bold header, Green Living Magazine. They explained that one of their freelance photographers had stumbled upon my garden and been captivated by its unique charm. They wanted to feature it in their upcoming issue as part of a story highlighting creative backyard spaces that challenge the traditional suburban mold. The words nearly leapt off the page. My garden, called Messy by Karen and labeled non-compliant by the HOA, was now being recognized as creative, innovative, and worthy of national attention. The irony was almost too sweet. Of course, the news couldn't stay quiet for long. When the magazine crew arrived for the official photo shoot, neighbors began peeking out from behind blinds and across porches. Karen stood on her driveway, arms folded tighter than ever, watching in visible disbelief as a professional team carried cameras, reflectors, and notebooks into my yard. She hovered across the street the entire time, muttering under her breath, pacing like a guard dog watching trespassers. Her irritation boiled over into fury when the issue finally hit the shelves. There, in glossy print, was my garden. Photos sprawled across multiple pages, capturing every vibrant corner, every burst of wildflowers, every insect in mid-flight. The article praised it as one of the most creative yards in town, describing it as a living ecosystem that balances artistry with nature's touch. Words like inspiring, refreshing, and visionary were used to describe what Karen had so proudly called ugly. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Copies of the magazine circulated from house to house, neighbors flipping through the pages with curious fascination. People who had once avoided Karen's campaigns now had tangible proof that her crusade was misguided. Suddenly, my yard wasn't just tolerated, it was admired, but recognition didn't soften Karen. If anything, it hardened her resolve. Where others saw beauty validated, she saw humiliation. Her campaign to paint me as the neighborhood's problem had collapsed in front of her, and her reaction was immediate. Within days, she redoubled her complaints to the HOA, writing longer, angrier letters and demanding they issue fines regardless of outside opinions. She even accused me of bribing the magazine, insisting no real gardening professional could possibly call my yard beautiful. The HOA, caught between the mounting attention from the article and Karen's relentless pressure, began to crack. They issued another letter, this time more severe, stating that though the magazine feature was noted, I was still required to bring my yard into compliance with community standards. It was a thinly disguised attempt to appease Karen while covering their own tracks. But by now, the balance of power had shifted. Neighbors began voicing their support openly, some even writing to the HOA themselves. A petition circulated quietly, led by those who were tired of Karen's overreach. They argued that my yard added value, not harm, to the neighborhood. Children begged their parents to walk past it on the way to school, and even those who had once hesitated to challenge Karen found themselves emboldened by the magazine's recognition. Karen's once unshakable authority was slipping, and she knew it, but her obsession had grown too deep to let go. If she couldn't shame me into changing, she would find another way to force the HOA into action. Her fixation became an all-consuming mission, and she was willing to bend rules, twist words, and even step outside the boundaries of reason to regain control. And though I celebrated the magazine feature as a victory, I underestimated just how far Karen was willing to go. Because in her mind, this wasn't just about a garden anymore. It was about pride, control, and the desperate need to prove she was right, even if it meant destroying everything around her. The seeds of conflict had been planted long ago, but now they were about to grow into something much darker. Karen's resentment festered like a wound that refused to heal. Each time she saw another car slow down in front of my garden, each time she overheard neighbors talking about the magazine feature, each time someone dared compliment me, it was another thorn in her pride. To her, it was no longer about plants or flowers. It was about dominance, about reclaiming her role as the voice of authority in the neighborhood. And so, Karen escalated. The first signs were small but intentional. Anonymous complaints were filed to the city inspector, citing unpermitted structures in my yard. Weeks later, animal control received a call suggesting my property harbored unsafe wildlife due to the increase in butterflies and bees. Of course, none of these claims held any weight, and each investigation ended with a shrug from the officials. But the interruptions were constant, draining, and designed to harass me into submission. The HOA, still under Karen's thumb, attempted to ride both sides of the conflict. They issued vague memos reminding residents about uniformity, thinly veiled jabs directed at me without naming names. Yet, behind the curtain, I learned that more neighbors had begun pushing back against Karen. The petition to revise the landscaping rules gathered signatures quickly, with people tired of manicured monotony and craving individuality. Karen, however, dismissed it all as betrayal. She wasn't used to losing ground. One evening, as twilight painted the sky with soft pinks and purples, I walked outside to water the plants. To my shock, I noticed footprints pressed deep into the soil near the edge of the garden. Branches were broken. Several flowers had been trampled deliberately, stems bent and petals torn. It wasn't the random chaos of children running through. It was destruction, intentional and cruel. Though I had no proof, I knew who it was. Karen had crossed from words to actions. The next morning, I installed cameras around the yard. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was necessary protection. For a while, the damage stopped, perhaps because she had realized she was being watched. But Karen wasn't finished. She was waiting, plotting, biding her time until she could strike in a way that left no doubt. Her opportunity came sooner than anyone expected. The HOA announced an upcoming community meeting, one where residents would be allowed to voice concerns, and proposed changes to neighborhood rules. The petition for more freedom in landscaping would be discussed. This was Karen's chance to regain control or lose it entirely. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse filled with people far more than usual. Some came out of curiosity, others because they were tired of the endless feud. The air was tense, as though everyone understood this wasn't just a debate about plants. It was a battle for the spirit of the neighborhood itself. Karen spoke first, her voice sharp and commanding. She painted my garden as a threat, calling it a breeding ground for pests and accusing it of lowering property values. She waved copies of HOA guidelines like sacred scripture, insisting rules must be enforced or the entire neighborhood would descend into chaos. Her words dripped with venom, but for the first time, they didn't land the way she expected. Murmurs of disagreement spread through the room. People shifted in their seats, unimpressed by her theatrics. When the floor opened for others, neighbors rose one by one. A young couple spoke about how their children loved walking by the garden every morning, pointing out butterflies and bees. An elderly resident mentioned how refreshing it was to see something colorful and alive instead of endless rows of beige grass. Another neighbor boldly stated that the magazine feature had put their community on the map in a positive light. The tide was turning in real time. Karen's face twisted with disbelief as voices stacked against her. For years, she had been the loudest, most influential presence in the room, but now she was being drowned out by a chorus of support for the very thing she despised. Finally, it was my turn to speak. I kept my words measured, calm, and focused, not on Karen, but on the garden itself. I spoke of its role in supporting pollinators, in conserving water through native plants, in bringing neighbors together. I reminded them that individuality and creativity didn't destroy community. They strengthened it. By the time I finished, the vote was inevitable. The HOA, bowing to the clear majority, announced that the rules would be revised. Residents would now have more freedom in landscaping choices, provided they remained safe and did not block visibility. My garden was officially declared compliant, not only safe from further harassment, but protected as a precedent for others. The room erupted in applause. For many, it wasn't just about plants. It was about freedom from Karen's suffocating grip. And in that moment, Karen finally broke. Her voice rose above the crowd in a shrill outburst, accusing everyone of betrayal, calling the HOA corrupt, and even threatening to move away if this madness continued. But her words, once feared, now sounded hollow. Neighbors who once tolerated her stared with cold detachment. The queen of control had lost her crown, and all she had left were empty threats. In the weeks that followed, Karen grew quiet. She no longer patrolled the streets with her clipboard or lingered on driveways to glare at passers-by. Rumors spread that she had been removed from her unofficial role within the HOA after too many complaints about her harassment. Eventually, a "for sale" sign appeared in her yard. By the end of the summer, she was gone, but the garden remained. As seasons passed, it continued to thrive, becoming a landmark within the neighborhood. More residents experimented with their yards, planting flowers, herbs, and shrubs of their own. Diversity bloomed where uniformity once reigned. What had started as one woman's stubborn project had sparked a quiet revolution, and every time I flipped through the pages of that gardening magazine, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. The very thing Karen tried to destroy had become the symbol of her downfall. She called my garden ugly, but in the end it revealed her true ugliness to the world. And while she faded into memory, my garden grew brighter, wilder, and more beautiful with every passing day.